the period we're going to be looking at is sort of the early 19th century, leading to just the pre-Victorian period, going into the Victorian period, and a little bit into the Victorian period as well. But these are just a few snapshots to kind of set the tone. These are some reflections of a noble woman reflecting on the changes that have taken place over the course of her lifetime. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau's novel Nouvelle Louise was very popular in the 18th century, and in the early 19th century she's reflecting on that. She says, in my own day, all mothers strictly forbade their daughters to read Rousseau's Nouvelle Louise, and all daughters, of course, longed to read nothing so much. I knew one young lady who owned to me that she stole a reading of it standing at the top steps of her father's library ladder, and another who procured it and carried it into the country with her on her wedding day as the first fruits of her being her own mistress. Yet within these few years, I happened to hear a girl of very warm feeling, enthusiastic, romantic, just the person whose head it would have turned of old, declare that she had tried to read it but been so disgusted that she threw it away before she got through half the first volume. This is from Francis Place. He was a fairly well-known tailor, part of some reform movements in the early 19th century, and he, in his autobiography, recorded the changes that he saw in British society in sort of the working class circles he was a part of. So he writes, the songs which were ordinarily sung by young men and women and the lewd plays and interludes they occasionally saw were all calculated to produce mischief in the direction of unchastity. The whole of this is materially changed. The songs have all disappeared and are altogether unknown to young girls. And again from Francis Place, we are a much better people now than we were then, better instructed, more sincere and kind-hearted, less gross and brutal, and have fewer of the concomitant vices of a less civilized state. And this is maybe one of my favorite stories that Walter Scott, the great novelist Walter Scott, recounts this story. What happened was one of his aunts asked him if she could procure for him the works of Aphra Behn, not very well known today, but he was a famous novelist and writer in the 17th century. And he said, are you sure? And she said, yeah, please. So he sent them to her, wrapped in brown paper with a courier. And then she sent them back, telling him to burn them. And this is what she wrote in the letter. I found it impossible to get through the very first of the novels. But is it not odd that I, an old woman of 80 and upwards, sitting alone, feel myself ashamed to read a book which 60 years ago I have heard read aloud for large circles consisting of the first and most creditable society in London. And then this was something kind of from my own research. One of the things that I kind of enjoyed looking at was expurgation or Bowdlerism, the phenomenon of taking classical works and then cutting out the bits that are deemed offensive, right? So I looked at that particularly for Chaucer and Shakespeare, which were the most expurgated authors because they were both very well known and they had lots of parts to them which were highly objectionable in the 19th century. And so this was sort of looking at all the editions in English of Chaucer in particular. And it would be very similar but with more editions with Shakespeare. And you see that in the earlier period it was sort of a mix. There were some sort of lightly expurgated editions. There wasn't much in the middle period. But then the later period between 1833 and 1845, the only new editions of Chaucer were heavily expurgated, heavily Bowdlerized. So no one was putting out new editions of Chaucer without cutting out big portions that were considered objectionable to the general public. And these are, well, just sort of a technical point, these are modern English translations of the Middle English Chaucer. You could still have gotten the complete Chaucer in the Middle English, but that's pretty hard to read. So that in terms of the ones translated into modern English, they would have all been expurgated. Well, All of this is kind of anecdotal, but it reflects something generally acknowledged by historians, and that is that there was a momentous cultural shift in Britain in the early 19th century. And as these quotes evidence, it was something that was certainly perceived at the time to be the case. And it was a subject of wonderment. It was a kind of moral chastening that had come over the nation. And the overall tone was felt to have been dramatically improved. Now, the reasons for this change is something that's still debated, as you can imagine, by historians, and there are many different causes that contributed. But I'm convinced that at the very top of the causes, we would have to list the evangelical revival of the 18th century and its sort of ripple effects across the culture in the decades that followed. If you know anything at all about this period and about evangelicals in this period, the name that probably comes to your mind is William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce and his circle, known as the Clapham sect, are usually remembered for one thing today. What would that be? Anybody? That's right, the abolition of the slave trade and eventually slavery. But equally important, and I think certainly it would have seemed equally important to them, was their work for moral and social reform during the period. Famously, Wilberforce had written in his diary in 1787, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." And of course, manners then meant something a bit bigger than what we think of as manners, sort of moral behavior and so forth. And indeed, for the next 50 years, he would work tirelessly for both of these causes. The changes that took place during the period were profound and were lasting. I would argue to you that the things that we associate with sort of British Victorian values, respectability, propriety, self-control, philanthropy, sexual restraint, all of these things have their roots in this period and in the changes that took place in British society during this period. And it was also, and not coincidentally, the period when evangelicals came to have a larger influence over British society than they'd ever had before and than they'd ever had since. It was sort of the high watermark, or it led to, in the mid-century, sort of the high watermark for evangelical influence. They were never a majority in Britain, but in many ways they came to set the tone during this period. Their hymns were the soundtrack of the 19th century. Their social reforms pricked myriad consciences. Their missionary mobilization captured the imagination of a nation. And so in what follows, first I want to try to understand their concerns and motivations in sort of one area, what made them tick, what their mental world was, and how that inspired their actions. It's not a comprehensive picture. I'm focusing sort of on one aspect, or kind of a constellation of aspects, which I'm calling the ethic of innocence. And it's a key part of their worldview, especially in terms of their efforts to bring about social change, social reform. And then the second part of the presentation, I want to suggest some things we might learn from this, and ways to maybe apply the mentality, the perspective of these evangelicals to our situation. Vastly different situation, obviously, in Europe today. But these, I would argue, were spiritual giants whom God used in mighty ways, and we do well to ask ourselves what we can learn from them. So before we jump into a description of what I'm calling this ethic of innocence, a little bit of a cast of characters. So William Wilberforce, probably the most well-known to you, parliamentarian, activist. He was undoubtedly the most famous and influential evangelical figure during the period. It's almost impossible to find some aspect of social reform in Britain during the period that he wasn't connected to in some way. He was just amazingly, prodigiously active during the time. Hannah More, less well known today, though wrongly so in my opinion, was a lady who wrote advice literature and tracts, moral reformer, also a member of the Clapham sect. And she was probably almost as prominent as Wilberforce at the time in British society. And then there's a host of lesser figures, lesser known figures. that were writing sermons, writing tracts, writing advice literature that was sort of permeating the culture. One of them that I'll quote from a couple times is named Thomas Gisborne, and there were others like him as well. A measure of their influence is that these sort of moral reformers at the time were often ridiculed in the larger culture. And so here, for example, we see in 1822 a send-up of Wilberforce. I don't actually think he was at the forefront of this, but he was always associated with all these efforts. So a statue was put up of the Duke of Wellington commemorating his victory over Napoleon, and he was represented as a naked Achilles, and there was some protest about this. Seems odd, actually, doesn't it, in a way, but there was still that sort of classical imagination, and so he's represented here as trying to shun or kind of avoid anything objectionable to the larger public. I think they did put a fig leaf on the Duke of Wellington eventually. It's important to note, maybe before going into this much more, that the boundary lines between evangelicals and other Christians were not always sharply drawn. And so you had prominent influential moralists during this period who probably would not have associated with evangelicals, but who were co-belligerents, if you will. And I'll be quoting from a couple of them. One is Sarah Trimmer, who was an education reformer, very, very influential for her works on education during the time. Henrietta Bowdler was the sister of Thomas Bowdler, from which we get the word Bowdlerize. And she actually published the first edition of the Bowdler family Shakespeare, but also was famous for her sermons that were published anonymously because she was a woman, but they came to be, eventually came out that she was the authoress. And so she was quite influential. We'll be quoting a bit from her as well. So what I'm calling the ethic of innocence is a number of related beliefs and attitudes, all of which were concerned in some way with the importance of moral formation, character development, and more specifically, the protection of moral innocence. So I've sort of made a Venn diagram of some of these attitudes. Depending on your personality type, you're either going to find this really helpful or incredibly confusing. And so if you're a very visual person like I am, this will go, oh, this makes sense. And some of you will just think, this is just chaos. So you'd probably have to have a bit more time to look at it. But this is an effort to try to put together these related beliefs and try to map them in sort of a mental map. And so what I'm calling the ethic of innocence are these ones sort of inside that yellow dotted line, these related beliefs. We're not going to look at all of them. We're going to highlight 5 of them today. What I'm calling aesthetic moralism, malleabilism, modesty, or from the French pudeur, which we could call innocence proper, chastity, and seriousness. So I'll kind of explain a little bit each of those as we go forward. So first of all, seriousness. It's impossible to read the writings of evangelicals in this period. If you pick up some of the writings during this period, if you read Wilberforce's famous book on practical Christianity, or any of Hannah More's writings, or the other writings, it's impossible not to be struck by the intensity of their commitment. Right? Many of them had experienced dramatic conversions, and what this represented was a kind of forswearing of a kind of dissolute life in favor of one focused on duty and on eternity. Remember that this was a time when the whole culture was Christian. There had been very, very, very few people at the time who wouldn't identify as Christian. But there were Christians, and then there were vital Christians, or serious Christians, right? And they were often mocked by the rest of society. And this is the sort of the milieu in which evangelicalism sort of sprung up. One classic work on the evangelical influence during this period is summarized in the title, The Call to Seriousness. The Call to Seriousness. Have done with lesser things, right? Let's focus here on what really matters. At the heart of Wilberforce's best-selling book, which was really a contrast. It took off like wildfire, this book. Many reprints. And the whole thesis was contrasting everyday, typical Christianity in Britain with real Christianity, as it ought to be from the New Testament, right? And that was the kind where every area of one's life ought to be brought under the scrutiny of the gospel and of Christ. So we find an emphasis, for example, in maintaining a clean conscience before God at all times. Hannah More. So just a few, what I'm going to do here is just give you a few representative extracts, just because I think it's better for you to hear it in their words than in mine. She puts it this way: to subdue a worldly temper, to control irregular desires, to have a clean heart is to extinguish the soul and spirit and essence of sin. A recurring the Christian life is described in a way that echoes, I think, probably the Puritan vision of the Christian life, and that's one of hard work in growth of holiness. Wilberforce, in his practical view, puts it this way: while the servants of Christ continue in this life, glorious as is the issue of their labors, they receive but too many humiliating memorials of their remaining imperfections, and they daily find reason to confess that they cannot do the things that they would. Their determination, however, is still unshaken, and it is the fixed desire of their hearts to improve in all holiness, and this, let it be observed, on many accounts. He goes on to describe what that looks like. And a recurring aspect of this that you run into is this sort of notion that there are no little sins. There are no sort of excusable sins. John Bowles puts it this way: should it be thought, and he's describing here sort of the entertainment of Christians and how they occupy their time. And he says, should it be thought that some of the topics which have here been noticed have received more attention than they deserve, it should be remembered that nothing can be of trifling importance which relates to morals, and that an imperceptible stream may, by undermining the foundations, gradually endanger the safety of a building, which might securely defy the violence of a torrent. So by sort of accumulation of small sins that are undealt with, the whole structure can be shaken. A particular area of concern was novels and the theater. So we find this recurring again and again. They're concerned with the proliferation of novels and with the morality of the theater. Gisborne is exhorting his female readers not to go to the theater, and he puts it this way: is the British stage now irreproachable? Does it exhibit no scenes which give pain to modest eyes, no language grating to modest ears? Does it exhibit nothing which a Christian need be ashamed of writing, of acting, of witnessing? Let those who are best acquainted with the theater answer the question to their own conscience. So pretty high standard, right, for what should be seen. The second area is what I'm calling aesthetic moralism, and I think it's quite profound, and I want to take a moment to sort of lay it out for you. Their perspective was one which was shared, I'd say, pretty much universally at the time by the educated class. And the key idea is, in their envisioning of aesthetics and sort of attributing aesthetic value to something in the arts, they didn't have a strict separation between what's aesthetically excellent and what's morally uplifting. Right? Those weren't entirely separate categories in their mind. The aesthetic and the moral surely are distinct, but they also saw them as interrelated, right? As not entirely separate. So it follows by definition, something that's truly immoral can never be considered great artistically or aesthetically, right? So therefore, part of the function of the arts, in their understanding, is to elevate the soul, right? To make one better, to edify in some sense. So you see, for example, Thomas Gisborne here: it is necessary that vice not be clothed in amiable colors, in colors which may disguise its deformity from the spectator. So vice should never be made to appear attractive. It should never, because then the quality of the artistic production can deceive, right? These things shouldn't be put together, great art and something corrupting. I think one really powerful example of this was a review that was given to this major expurgated version of Shakespeare, the Bowdler family Shakespeare. And that's, again, where we get the word to Bowdlerize in English. And this was a review not in a Christian magazine, though, of course, the society, the culture was Christian. But look at the language that he uses here. He says, Mr. Bowdler has not executed his task, anything of the precise or prudish spirit. He's only effaced those gross indecencies which everyone must have felt as blemishes. And then he says, and by the removal of which no imaginable excellence can be effected. Right? Because they're morally gross, they can't affect the artistic excellence if you remove them. It has in general been found easy to extirpate the offensive expressions of our great poet without any injury to the context or any visible scar or blank in the composition. They turn out to be not so much cankers in the flowers as weeds that have sprung up by their side. So he's saying the parts of Shakespeare that are objectionable, we can remove them without any injury to his work, to its aesthetic value, because by definition, being immoral, they don't belong there in the first place. And actually, the artistic value is higher now. Well, I don't need to tell you that this is a very different view, right, than the one that would be dominant today in literary and other art circles. But this was very much mainstream, and not just by evangelicals. And he was probably the most influential reviewer in the most influential journal of the period, and not at all an evangelical. Likewise, the received view was that, as Milton had put it, saying that a good poet has to first be a good man. Part of the reason that Lord Byron's works were considered to be so objectionable and were met with such consternation was this very thing, that there was this juxtaposition between a notoriously immoral man producing this poetry, and that produced a lot of consternation for people. And so we speak to repel all that is pure from the perusal of this enchanted repository of pollution. Notice the kind of words that are being used here. We have here, for the first time in history of our literature, a great work of which the very basis is infidelity and licentiousness, and the most obtrusive ornaments are impure imaginations and blasphemous sneers. The poet has constructed the most spacious and splendid temple of lust and impiety that's ever been reared by human profligacy and Jesus. I don't know if any of you try to read Byron, but he's really pretty unreadable for, I think, moderns, for us. And we probably would trouble to see what is so objectionable in Byron. But for the time, he was considered really provocative. He struck a blow against the honor and happiness of his species, and which will make him remembered. Again, this is not actually written in a Christian periodical, so that represents sort of the general attitude. Again, he who should prove to us that one really great poet was radically a cold, selfish, bad man would indeed do more to poison the source of kindliness and charity and every noble sentiment than all the satirists that ever denied or derided virtue from the beginning of the world. You cannot be a great poet and a bad man. Right? The two are incompatible in their imagination and their ways of envisioning this. This is often summarized in the dictum that comes from Horace, that the aim of poetry is to instruct by pleasing. And this is probably made popular by Samuel Johnson, who referred to it in his very influential introduction to the plays of William Shakespeare. So the end of writing is to instruct, the end of poetry is to instruct by pleasing. And then he adds, for it is always a writer's duty to make the world better. But in fact, it was applied not just to poetry, but to the arts in general. And I think this really reflects the overwhelming attitude that, yes, there's an aspect of pleasure, of aesthetics in the arts, but their aim is to use that to elevate us, to make us better. And that's the definition of good art. And until the rise of what became known as aestheticism in the second half of the 19th century, you might know it for its sort of rallying cry, l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. This was the shared conviction about the purpose of the arts, right, to elevate the soul. The next area that I want to draw attention to is what I'm calling malleabilism. And it's just sort of an emphasis in the way that character was viewed. For those of you who are sort of students of intellectual history, it's not hard to detect the influence of Locke here. Right? You think of the tabula rasa, that notion that human beings are sort of a blank to be imprinted upon and highly malleable. So we see that kind of language. More often than sort of the image of a slate is an image that I saw that occurs repeatedly during the period, which brings us back to the meaning of the word culture itself, right? The agricultural roots of the word. So, for example, Thomas Gisborne puts it like this: the mind is originally an unsown field, prepared for the reception of any crop. And if those to whom the culture of it belongs neglect to fill it with good grain, it will speedily be covered with weeds. If right principles of action are not implanted, wrong principles will sprout up. I think we might detect a bit more of a Calvinist orientation here, because it's not just blank, right? It's unsown. But if you don't actively put good seed into it, it's the weeds. That's what'll take over. So that's sort of the image that's used. And the concern, of course, the seed, if you will, is the influences that are sown into a person's mind. Hannah More here, again talking about the influence of novels. She says, such fascinating qualities are lavished on the seducer and such attractive graces on the seduced, that the images indulged with delight by the fancy carry on the reader imperceptibly to a point which is not so far from their indulgence in the act as some imagine. In other words, to take pleasure in representations of vice, something inherently sinful, is in some sense to already be associated with it, to be influenced by it, to even be changed by it, and a first step towards actually committing the sin. Same idea here expressed by Henrietta Baldwin. When I exhort a well-educated and virtuous youth to avoid drunkenness, gaming, adultery, murder, he'll perhaps answer as Hazael did to the prophet, "What? Is thy servant a dog that he should do this thing?" God grant that he may always hear of these vices with the same honest indignation. But in order to do this, he must not presume too much on his own strength, and he must carefully avoid all the temptations I've already mentioned. And these are temptations of influence, of exposure, right? Not the actual committing of the deed. Or he may be led on, step by step, till he lose his principles, his character, his innocence, and his happiness. Underneath this, I think from an evangelical point of view, lay a conviction that human character was in fact then not neutral, but corrupted by sin, so that there has to be a conscious counter-influence, counter-action to go against this natural propensity. And this is what Hannah More makes explicit. Is it not a fundamental error to consider children as innocent beings whose little weaknesses may perhaps want some correction, rather than as beings who bring into the world a corrupt nature and evil dispositions, which it should be the great end of education to rectify? All right, well, the fourth area is what I'm here calling innocence. I think modesty might be a better term for it, except we don't use the term modesty in this sense as much today. But it's a kind of evaluation of modesty in the sense of a kind of modesty of the eyes, right? A concern to avoid, or the ears, concern to avoid things which would contaminate the soul or warp the mind. So when it comes to, for example, Lord Byron, again, we have in the Christian Observer, which was the sort of evangelical magazine of the period. I will not undertake to say which of Lord Byron's poems may be or not read without danger, but all works palpably evil or even doubtful, the duty of the Christian is clear: to abstain from familiarity with them. In other words, it's not a matter of careful or judicious use, right? The Christian should avoid all familiarity with these kind of things which would taint the soul. For indeed, not all knowledge is conceived of as good in itself. Hannah More says, the sense in which Christian parents would wish to impress on their children to know the world is to know its emptiness, its vanity, its futility, and its wickedness. To know it is to despise it. And in this view, an obscure Christian in a village may be said to know it better than a hoary courtier or a wily politician. For how can they be said to know it who go on to love it, to value it, to be led captive by its allurements, to give their soul in exchange for its lying promises? And again, there is some knowledge of which it is a praise not to know. And then she kind of wrestles with the question here of sheltering. Some of the parents today wrestle with, to what degree should we shelter our children from the world? And she says it may be urged that as soon as young persons get out of their parents' hands, they'll naturally choose their books for themselves. She's just been talking about protecting them from certain books. This is granted, but is not every year which prolongs their precious innocence a year gained? May not within that period the nascent libertinism be checked, the ardent imagination fixed to other pursuits, the sentiment of virtue kindled, the taste for purity, important word, taste for purity, confirmed, and the habit, another important word, the habit and love of prayer established. So the argument for sheltering one's children from worldly influences is, yes, they will have to face them eventually, but best delay that moment as long as possible to, in a sense, strengthen their defenses for when that day comes, right? That they'll be ready and they will have been trained up to be strong to resist them. And that leads, of course, to a classic dilemma, which is whether it's better to protect someone by some exposure and warning them or by keeping them innocent of it. And this is something that writers were well aware of then. And so, for example, this is a review of French novels. The French are often viewed as the source of corruption during the time. That he acknowledges that he wrestled with whether to even present a review to draw attention to them. Better maybe to just not mention it. In the end, he reviewed it on the argument that it's better to label something poison than to leave it unlabeled. The writer Rochelle Gerstein wrote a very helpful book, kind of is focused on the U.S., but dealing with what she calls the party of reticence, and she expressed this mentality this way. For the party of reticence, indecent, filthy, unnameable, and shameful things went beyond the limit of human understanding. They were, in other words, beyond the pale, and transgressed the boundaries of social order. Consequently, speaking of them was to commit a powerful act of pollution and contagion. So what is at stake, in a sense, is the boundaries of what's thinkable. What is beyond the thinkable? What should be unthinkable and unknown? And also what's permitted to exist within the bounds of the social order. Just one more slide on this. It's from a later period. It's from the early 20th century. But it reflects this attitude very well. And the context here is that there was a bill that came up in the British Parliament about criminalizing lesbian acts, because sodomy was illegal, but there were no laws against lesbian acts. And so now this was coming up, and something occasioned them discussing whether they should put this in law. And this was the comment of one parliamentarian. He said, he was speaking against having this made into a law. And he said, you are going to tell the whole world that there is such an offense, to bring it to the notice of women who have never heard of it, never thought of it, never dreamt of it. I think this is a very great mischief. And indeed, it wasn't passed into law for that reason, as far as we can tell. It was sort of to remain beyond the realm of the conceivable. Well, the last one that I want to draw attention to is what we might call chastity proper, and the way that it was conceptualized as essential and fundamental good. Now, if you've read any of the novels of Jane Austen, or watched any of the kind of movies the last 20, 30 years of some of Jane Austen's novels, you probably have a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about here, right? This sort of high valuation of chastity. You're transported there to a world so alien to our own in that respect, where chastity seems to exist as a kind of precious jewel, something to be admired, protected, praised, right? It was this part of the mentality of the time. This was grounded in part in a very high estimation of marriage and the family as kind of the great and central human good, and natural good that God has given us. So Henrietta Bowdler puts it this way: to the sacred institution of marriage we owe the greatest blessings which this imperfect state affords, and to it we owe many of the virtues which will lead us to heaven. And of course this reflects the centrality of marriage and family for Protestantism going right back to Luther, and it was brought out, I would argue, in even greater force with the Puritans. It was also a characteristic of the Evangelical revival in the 18th century. Hannah More energetically promoted the family in her writings. Many of her tracts were aimed at sort of winning men back from the tavern to the joys of domesticity and the hearth and the family. And so she painted a picture of domestic happiness as the sort of summum bonum of our earthly existence. And that became a characteristic of Victorian society later on. And in this respect, I think it's important to point out that contrary to popular stereotype, Christians during this time were not anti-sex. I've never found any evidence of this. They were discreet. They believed in the value of modesty, but a positive valuation was given to sexuality within marriage, and again, sort of veiled terms. But Henrietta Bowdler, who was not married, puts it like this: the glory of the Christian religion is that while it checks every approach to vice, condemns even a thought that is impure, it sanctifies all the virtuous affections of our nature. It connects every relation of life with our duty to God. It bids us perform for His sake all those kind offices which even natural affection would lead us to perform for our own. So it redeems and sanctifies our natural affections, which so easily could go in the wrong way. So she's giving this sort of positive appraisal. Likewise, this from the Christian Observer, sort of this picture of that's taken from a review of a advice manual for a new married couple. And it's actually kind of a beautiful picture of sexuality within marriage. Their equal regard to God diminished not one enjoyment in which a fond couple could share, but was, on the contrary, an additional source of pleasure. They delighted in God, and they delighted in the society of each other. However, their elevation of marriage meant that they were often ferocious in denouncing sexual sin as a kind of great spoiler. So John Bowles refers to it as that most pernicious and destructive of all vices, adultery, a vice hostile to an institution which is the parent of every other institution, the source of every social affection, and which is raised to the highest degree of sanctity. Guard us with the most distinguished care from any remotest danger of violation. They who kill the body have no more that they can do, but may every young woman look with horror on the wretch who under the pretense of love would rob her of her virtue, of the esteem of her friends, of her character in this world, and perhaps of her eternal happiness in the next. Now you notice sort of the female orientation here, and it's true that much of the attention was directed towards women, though one of the characteristics of the period was that sort of womanly virtues were increasingly being applied to men. And the damage of sexual sin in particular was limited for both sexes. So for example, this from Charles Kingsley's novel, Yeast, and he puts it like this. This is a young man who falls in love and now regrets his earlier sort of escapades. How gladly he would have welcomed centuries of a material hell to escape from the more awful spiritual hell within him, to buy back that pearl of innocence which he had cast recklessly to be trampled under the feet of his own swinish passions. So his remorse over his sort of sexual indiscretions before. And I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that just because evangelicals in the 19th century thought something that they were right and that we're wrong. There's no, we might be right and they're wrong, right? It could work in either direction. So we need to carefully evaluate their perspective and do that in the light of the scriptures. But we don't have time to do that in depth. So what I'm going to do is just sort of suggest some lines of inquiry, pose some questions, and kind of put some things out there. I do think it's good to immerse ourselves in the thinking of Christians from another age, just like it's good for us to immerse ourselves in the thinking of Christians from other countries, right? Because it takes us out of our own mentality. And so they may not be right, but it's helpful to sort of check and to critique things which we may be blind to in our own particular era, right? Ways that we've shifted without even being aware that we've shifted or why we've shifted. So here's just a few questions, and I might step on some toes with these, and so I'll just put it out there, and then you can respond afterwards. The first question is, have we underemphasized the importance of applying ourselves to godliness for fear of a works theology? Have we underemphasized the importance of applying ourselves to godliness for fear of a works theology? And I'm struck with the emphasis on sort of working out their salvation that was present at the time. I think we have to remember that grace means we don't earn, but it doesn't mean we don't strive or we don't work, right? And here I think sometimes we're guilty of a confusion between our salvation and our sanctification. We're saved by faith entirely apart from our own efforts. The Bible never says that about our sanctification, right? Of course, it's God who works in us. It's the power of His Spirit working in us. But we're repeatedly enjoined to work out our salvation, right? With fear and trembling, Paul says. So, do we teach enough on the importance of the Christian life as something which should be devoted to continuously and intentionally applying ourselves to growth, to making use of the means of grace that God has given us? So that's a question I'll put to you, and we can reflect on it more together. I wonder if we've absorbed an aestheticist view of the arts, which separates quality from edification. This may seem like a subtle or philosophical question, but I think it's useful to remember that this way of looking at the arts was considered radical in the 19th century. It was a radical break, both from the way Christians had described the role of the arts in society and from the classical view of the arts, right, going back to Plato and Aristotle. So this sharp distinction between goodness and beauty, right, in contrast to sort of the Platonic notion of the good, the true, and the beautiful all being united, that was a radical break. And so today it's the dominant viewpoint in our culture. Right? Art should be measured by the standards of art, not the standards of morality. And I wonder if we've been too quick to absorb this mentality without actually thinking about it. And are we too willing to engage with cultural productions with questionable or even negative spiritual value because of their supposed quality? Have we sort of adopted the mentality of our particular era? One of my mother's little dictums was, if it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. And that sort of stayed with me. I think there's some more I think on it, the real wisdom of that. If it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. It's something to ponder. Do we take seriously enough the degree to which our ideas and character are shaped by the media which we consume? So as I mentioned before, in the 18th century, most evangelicals thought that reading a novel was a sin. In the post-war period, not that long ago, most evangelical Christians would have thought that going to the movies was a sin. And I know some Christian families years ago who didn't have televisions, so they wouldn't be contaminated by the world. Now, maybe all of these perspectives were too narrow. Maybe they were in danger of legalism. But as our culture has shifted further from Christian foundations, as the internet has flooded us with an almost unlimited amount of content, which almost all of us are consuming, do we think carefully enough about how our media consumption is forming us? Do we teach this in our churches? Do we make it a basic discipleship issue? Are we intentional enough in promoting content which will elevate and edify amongst other Christians? From a desire not to be thought prudish or old-fashioned, do we value properly the importance of being innocent of evil? That phrase from Romans 16:19, be innocent of evil. I think of that phrase from Hannah More, There is a knowledge, it is praise not to know. It echoes Ephesians 5:12, right? It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. And I'm not sure that this notion of some things being unspeakable is really any longer part of how we conceptualize the world as evangelicals today. And in this, I think we reflect a dramatic change which has come over Western society and the Christian world in the last 100 years or so. In the current environment, I think to paraphrase Roosevelt, the only thing we have to be ashamed of is shame itself, right? But is this right for us as believers? And if not, how can we cultivate a kind of modesty of the eyes, modesty of the mouth, modesty of the ears, to sort of nourish a kind of godly innocence of evil? And in an effort not to be overly judgmental, do we properly estimate and warn against the destructiveness of sexual sin? It's true that sexual sins are not intrinsically worse than other sins, and perhaps they were given undue importance in the past. And it's also true that we need to proclaim God's grace and the fact that He brings restoration to those who've escaped the grip of sexual sin. At the same time, the scriptures tell us that there's something about sexual sin which is different. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that all other sins someone commits are outside the body. But when one sins sexually, one sins against one's own body. And I think most of us know that this is true from experience, right? Our own experience or those of others that we've known. Sexual sin leaves deep and lasting wounds that can take a lifetime to heal. Conversely, the benefits of chastity, whether in singleness or in marriage, are manifold, and they bring so much blessing in our lives. Do we warn young people adequately? Or do we treat sexual sin as a minor thing? I know that here in Europe, in many places in Europe, I know that evangelical churches actually have an expectation that sexual sin is normal. It's just to be expected. And what can you do about it? And it's not even really spoken of, or very little. Is this right? Is this honoring to the Lord? Is this what He wants for us? And then in wanting to affirm single persons, do we properly elevate marriage and family as God intended, as the context for human flourishing? Now, I say this carefully because I didn't marry till I was 43. So I have a special place in my heart for single people. Right? I was a pastor for years before I was married. So we should honor singleness, whether as a special calling or by the result of unchosen circumstances. However, do we elevate marriage and family sufficiently as God's good gift for our humanity in the normal context for most Christians? Do we properly encourage young people to think of marrying as the normal thing, to look for it, to prepare for it, to pray for it? Or have we absorbed our culture's notion of marriage as a kind of elective choice, an optional situation, one amongst many? Hannah More only wrote one novel. It was called Celebs in Search of a Wife. And it was an instruction manual for young men looking for wives. Now, I suspect today most evangelicals would be embarrassed to write a book like that or to be seen with a book like that, right? It just seems crass. Should we be? Or should we be doing more to teach young men and women how to be intentional about marriage? I know in my situation, while on the one hand I think it was God's will for me to marry later, it was part of His sovereign plan, at the same time I know I would have benefited from more practical counsel as a young man, from maybe some urges from some godly men older than me, so pushing me a little bit in that direction to help me along. I had some wrong ideas about marriage, and I had wrong ideas about what to look for in a mate. So are we helping single people enough in this area? Are we intentional enough in our discipleship with children and new believers especially, in emphasizing the importance of a kind of ecosystem of habits and associations? I think James K. Smith, some of you will know his work, I think has offered a helpful corrective here. Envisioning the Christian life not only as an assent to certain beliefs and the sort of orientation of one's will, but in very practical terms, as a way of life which is being joined. To become a Christian is to join the Christians in living in a certain way, in certain rhythms, habits, and associations. Have we taken that seriously in our discipleship? And then lastly, are we too shy of giving Christians practical guidance in everyday matters for fear of seeming legalistic? Evangelicalism today looks very different from how it looked 200 years ago or even 50 years ago. And I think the drum that we're often beating today is that we don't want to be legalistic or moralistic. We don't want to emphasize secondary things. We want to stick to the gospel. But I wonder if the pendulum has gone too far the other way. The scriptures are full of very practical guidance and instructions, aren't they? And we all need to grow, and we all need that to grow. I think of just one example, I think of quiet times. I think when I grew up, it was drummed into us, the importance of having quiet times. And of course, the Bible doesn't say it's a commandment, thou shalt have a quiet time. But it was drilled that it's really important to spend time in God's Word and in prayer every day, to create a rhythm and a pattern of that in your life. That's not taught to young people in the same way today, is my experience. It's not emphasized in the same way. Partly, I think, again, a desire not to seem legalistic. I remember I was told, no Bible, no breakfast, sort of as a good rule of thumb as a child. I remember that. That stayed with me. I know the Bible doesn't say that, right? It's not a law from the Scripture. But it was a good rule of thumb. And I can bear testimony, there were many days when I read my Bible and didn't have breakfast because I ran out of time. Well, wasn't that a good choice in the end, to have spiritual food and no physical food, if you have to choose? Right? I'm thankful for that very practical, proverbial kind of guidance that was given to me. And do we do that enough? Do we give people concrete, practical advice and ways of living their Christian lives to grow? I remember, I'll end on a slightly irreverent note. A guy I knew years ago used to spend a lot of time working in prison ministry. And he would be working with new Christians in prison and sort of helping them grow in the Lord. And one thing he would emphasize was starting your day with prayer and with the Lord. And he said, what I say to them is this. I say, what's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? And they always say the same thing. So take a pee. And he say, right. Well, if you prayed first, then it would be a holy pee. So